Chapter 135. The limbs of Nate's crossbow sang as they released, only to tighten again as he slapped another bolt into place while charging it. He cursed and jumped back, a dizzy aura by his side. They had somehow managed to practically step right onto a sleeping snake. Nate's boot had been what dug into the thing's tail, but aura was who it bit right in the leg. It had been venomous, and she was starting to feel the effects as they fled from all its slithering friends. She had already taken a pill for it from her inventory, and was just waiting for it to take effect. In the meantime, she was having problems concentrating enough to use her energy skills. Nate's energy skills were having a larger effect. His chi blast was similar to a shotgun in the way it worked, making it perfect for crowd control. The crossbow bolts he was using with another energy skill called Chanced Affinity Arrow. That particular skill was based around activating two chance effects. The first was that the arrow had a chance of taking on the user's affinity, while the second effect was that it had a chance of hitting a weak point. They had been running for the last several minutes, accidentally heading farther away from the RV as they fled from the mass of snakes. "Come on, Aura, just hop into my chest already," he told her for the third time, watching as she stumbled to the side. The pill she had taken had helped, but it needed more time to get rid of the venom coursing through her body. He hoped the girls were all right. They had healing pills, but he wasn't sure if they had ever thought of getting ones for poison and venom as well. She grunted weakly and lurched toward him, her muzzle tapping his arm as she sank into him. Aura would heal faster inside his chest, near his cores. They had never tested whether she would come back to life if she died outside of the dungeon, or if she was limited in the same way Nate was. Frankly, it seemed better to assume that she was and not play around. Dodging the abnormally large snakes, he began heading back toward the RV and hopefully reinforcements. This was not a good situation for them to be in. With beasts this small, they would never be able to retrieve all the bodies. That meant that eventually, the bodies they missed would begin attracting attention, drawing more beasts to the area. All that is to say, that they would need to find a new place to park and sleep for the night. Any cores these snakes might have had would be lost as well. Angie, Lindsay?" he called out, as he hit the road and began sprinting back to where they had parked the vehicle. Behind him, a writhing mass of wriggling, hissing snakes burst from the underbrush and continued after him. Nate fired off another chi burst, the shotgun attack pushing them back momentarily. However, he had already used it so many times that his main core was running low on energy. He mentally switched cores and began drawing chi from his backup core instead for his attacks. That was the trick. He had to manually make the switch or wait until his main core was completely drained. That was generally not a good idea. It took him several minutes of running along the road before he finally spotted where they had pulled off. The bonus to this was that he had finally outpaced the snakes, even though more kept coming onto the road to chase after him. He called out to the girls several more times, his voice growing slightly hoarser each time. Finally, Anna responded, as she appeared by his side in a flash and cut all the snakes to pieces. "We need to leave now," she ordered. "Lindsay was bitten, and we don't have any pills to treat venom." Her voice was bitter, clearly blaming herself. "Aura was bitten as well. I have some pills she can take, but I agree that we need to leave this area, regardless." Nate was more than happy to see that Angie was sitting behind the wheel of the RV, with the lights and engine already on. As soon as they both jumped into the RV, Angie floored it. There were streaks of squished snakes left in their wake. Anna went up to join Angie, while Nate went to give Lindsay a couple of pills for poison and venom. Bright headlights and light racks lit up the road in the failing light. They had made sure that the RV was well equipped with lights. While their parents had paid for the initial vehicle, nearly all of the modifications to the RV had been designed and paid for by the kids. Some, like the small core converter, had obviously been outside of their price range. However, they had done their best to pay for everything themselves. Lindsay stirred weakly as he shoved a few pills down her throat, along with some water. "Thanks," she muttered with a cough. "Should have known that you would have some anti-venom pills already prepared." He chuckled and patted her leg. "All you had to do was ask. I'll give you both some of them later, so this doesn't happen again." She nodded and closed her eyes, going to sleep. I gave Lindsay the anti-venom pills. She should be fine in a while. Right now, she's just sleeping everything off. He told the other two, taking a seat right behind Anna. Angie let out a long, shuddering breath. Good, thank heavens you had those. I would have had to drive like mad to get to Colorado City in time. I'll give all three of you a few of them in the morning, so something like this doesn't happen again. Anna was frowning, unhappy with her own performance. It's only the first night, and I already almost got one of you killed. Nate rolled his eyes. Anna, do you even know how many times I have been poisoned, stabbed, clawed, or otherwise injured going out on expeditions with my parents? We all know how dangerous it is to leave the cities. Sure, this was not how we wanted things to begin, but we also never thought that this trip would be safe either. I know that, but it's different when I'm the one responsible for your safety still. Anna's hand was pale from how tight she was clenching it. Angie took them a couple of miles closer to the city before pulling over. I don't know about you two, but I'm ready for some sleep. Being chased by snakes and watching Lindsay getting bit wore me out. She muttered, stretching her arms out with a yawn. Make sure your door is locked, Nate reminded her, doing the same for the side door. I'll see you all in the morning. His bunk was nestled above the cab, while the girls were sharing the room at the back of the vehicle. For the next day or two, Anna would be using the table that sank down to become another bed as her own. Entering his avatar, Nate transferred to the kobold dungeon and readied his weapons. The kukris were strapped crosswise across his rear, while the Kriegsmesser was on his left hip. He had finally gotten a holster for the gun a while back, and it was strapped to his right thigh. He was loaded for bear, as people used to say on OE, and it still wouldn't be enough. Kobolds were annoying enemies. They were semi-intelligent and had strong natural armor. The theme of the dungeon he had put together against them, unfortunately, wasn't exactly the most effective. It had been the impetus in which he had later begun to refine how he approached the themes and overall creation of each dungeon. The amount of information he had for each one was less and less each time. In the beginning, he had tried to create traps and the entire dungeon all at once. Now, all he worried about was hiding the core, and sometimes a basic layout. That was it. Once the dungeon had been formed, he would watch and study the monsters, creatures, denizens, or whichever term fit them best. Then, when he was ready, he and Aura would fight them if needed. The two would learn what they could about them, and only then would he decide on the theme for the dungeon and the eventual traps. With the kobolds, he had been hasty and known them to be lizard-based. So, he had based the entire dungeon around ice. Coincidentally, he also learned how much he hated being cold. The issue was that while kobolds did indeed look like lizards, they had more in common with their draconic ancestors than their cold-blooded cousins. The cold and the various traps ended up doing more harm to him than them. There were still some that succumbed to them, but not as many as he had thought. At the moment, the dungeon core was researching glacial ice forms due to how hard and cold they tended to be. If regular ice wouldn't work, then he would just go even harder and colder. Nate shivered as the avatar settled into place in the dungeon. His armor was not exactly built to keep him warm. That wasn't its main function, and he felt sorry for the cultivators who entered this dungeon, unaware of what he had done in his ignorance. He needed more parts for the path artisans in the community to work with. If it wasn't for that, he wouldn't have willingly entered this place, especially not without Aura as backup. It was going to be a long, miserable night, at least if he managed to survive. Nate managed to take out one group of kobolds on his own before he decided to switch dungeons. Kobolds worked together and had their own language. They were like a high-form beast in that regard. They were smarter than the average beast by quite a lot. It wasn't quite fully formed like it had been with blighted elves or humans, but it was still there. They fought in groups and used weapons, even energy skills, on occasion. Not to mention their more obvious advantages of hard scales, strength, and some of them even being able to combine their liquids to create a small amount of fire. It wasn't much, but if you were close, it could still hurt. After working himself to the bone just to take out that one group, and only getting one scale and a rainbow orb for his efforts, he left. The ant and rat dungeons were out of the question, as they would simply swarm him. He had grown somewhat used to dying over the last year, but some deaths were worse than others. Those orchestrated by rats and insects were definitely rated among the worst that he had experienced to date. Going to either of those dungeons alone was simply suicide, even with the traps being somewhat effective. They could simply swarm those as well. Constantly repairing everything in those 2 dungeons was an absolute energy sink, and he couldn't wait to upgrade the dungeon core in both of them. The increased hardness of dungeon material would be a welcome reprieve on high energy expenditure. Unfortunately, there didn't seem to be much he could do about that one. He had tried researching materials in the past without any luck. It could do weaker ones just fine, but stronger was always where the problem lay. There were plenty of other dungeons, but only one viable one that he hadn't visited recently, the mixed skeleton, zombie, and lich dungeon. He swapped out the gun and equipped his crossbow and quiver. The crossbow was strapped to his back, while the quiver took the place of his gun and holster on his right leg. Nate tightened the strap on the crossbow and unsheathed the Kriegsmesser. His view on practicing multiple weapons had evolved over the last 8 months. Each of them had their uses, and he used them as such. This wasn't some story where the sword ruled all, or the equally ignorant belief that the spear was king. They each had their uses. That said, he still had to pick and choose which ones he learned and focused on. He would have loved to say that he was some once-in-a-millennium genius with weapons. The truth was, he had been practicing nearly constantly with the crossbow, kukris, and now Kriegsmesser since he had created the first dungeon. Countless hours were spent nearly every night with them in hand. Adding even more to the mix would just be insane. Chapter 136. A convoy of trucks with trailers encountered them on the road the next day. All the different professional expeditioners were heading out, with a few returning to the city, their trailers already loaded down. As with Pueblo, they decided to bypass Colorado City, driving around the walled city. The walls of this city were older than theirs had been. There were sections of old concrete still visible, where it had been constructed back before they had started using the newer impacted dirt method. If they were going to try and make it to Trinidad that day, then they needed to get a move on it. It was a short trip at only 61 miles, but there was a lot they needed to do once they were there. Not to mention, those miles were all over crappy, destroyed roads and terrain. The tires and suspension of the Overland RV were built for that sort of thing, and this would be a perfect area for them to discover its everyday limits. Would the rig be alright if they drove at a constant 30 miles an hour over semi-rough terrain? What about 40 miles an hour? They weren't talking about its true limits. They weren't trying to break it. They wanted to know what the RV could handle day in and day out without causing a problem. If they could maintain 30 miles an hour, then the trip would take a measly 2 hours. That was plenty doable in a day, even if they had to go slower. However, it would have larger implications on what they could expect going forward. With Lindsay behind the wheel, who had woken up that morning feeling perfectly fine, that was incredibly unlikely. If there was ever anyone who had a need for speed, it was her. The girl had a distinct tendency toward a lead foot. Thankfully, Aura was doing much better as well. Nate bit his lower lip as he glared at the energy counter, and then the number of dungeons he could still create. He had been playing it somewhat safe lately, taking things slowly, learning more about how everything worked. He had even come up with a new method for how to approach the dungeons. Yet, every time he needed to create another dungeon, he found himself hesitating. He hated seeing that creation map. Every time it came up, it always made him feel so hopeless. There were so many dimensional zones on Earth, and he was only one person. He clicked on the dungeon creation option and flicked the map a couple of times, sending it spinning about. For this next one, he wanted a location that he truly knew nothing about. The map stopped partially over Asia and the ocean. Zooming in, he saw Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, and several other countries. He increased the focus on South Korea, seeing that for such a small country, they had a rather alarming number of dimensional zones active there. He selected one near the ocean, around where he thought the city of Busan was. The cost of creating the dungeon core had increased by another 10,000 energy, making this one 370,000. It hurt to spend that much energy all at once. His main energy earners were all dungeons that he kept dying in, like the Kobold dungeon. The water elemental dungeon that he could even enter did pretty well for itself. Then there were the annoying dungeons, the ones filled with insects and rodents. The ant and rat dungeons, among others, while they had extreme numbers, that was really all they had. Each one of them barely gave any energy for even being inside the place, and their deaths were little better. He looked at the remaining energy in the shared pool, before shaking his head. What was left was going to be needed during the construction of the actual dungeons. It was better to stop while he was ahead on this one. Starting the 38th Dungeon Core was already pushing his comfort levels. Nate had been discreetly working on the dungeon, instead of meditating. Now that he had finished with what he wanted to do for the moment, he closed the menus and began meditating for real. Ever since he had properly worked through all the stanzas of the Void Art, his speed had increased. After finishing that, he had also taken the time to work on his old shadow meditation art as well. Anna tapped him on the shoulder, a little over an hour and a half later. They were getting close to Trinidad. Surprisingly, the ride had been fairly smooth. The road was cracked and pitted, but what Nate had failed to account for was that potholes came from constant use. Without the constant wear and tear on the roads, they had worn down, but at the same time were also in better condition in this part of the state than he had expected. Trinidad experienced fewer temperature swings than where they lived, and that had prevented additional pavement cracking and damage. Still, 100 years of neglect added up. The suspension of the Overlander RV and its massive tires did the rest to keep the ride smooth and comfortable for the inhabitants. There were jostles here and there, but as long as they kept the speed beneath 40 miles an hour, it wasn't too bad. Nate gently nudged Aura to the side from where she was lying, tanning herself with the sunlight from the windshield. "I didn't expect us to make the trip this quickly," he said, coming up behind Lindsay and Angie, who was now sitting in the passenger seat. Anna nodded. "It would have been better if we had taken another day or two to make sure you all were ready. But that is just me being extra sensitive because of last night. You all have been working as a group for months now, and know what you are doing. As long as you don't get in over your head, then you should be fine. The RV was just a little more capable than we had first anticipated, is all." "A little?" Lindsay asked with a snort. "Try a lot. This thing is a freaking tank, and I love it." The phrase took Nate by surprise for a moment, as he hadn't even realized that this world had tanks until right then. For the first few years after the dimensional zones appeared, the world had still held itself together for the most part. The portals and the invading enemies had been the unifying force for the entire world instead of 2 world wars. It was during that time that they had lost a lot of their manufacturing ability for planes. From what Anna had told him before, from when she had bought her car, there were companies working to regain what had been lost. However, the extreme noise always drew attention. Anytime they attempted actual test flights of any sort, they would be swarmed by animals and monsters who had been drawn to the noise. They continued to make progress, but it was incredibly slow as a result. The large Overlander RV slowed as the walls of Trinidad came into view. It was noon, and there were no other expedition trucks on the road around them. They had the entire place to themselves. That said, the guards at the wall would not recognize their vehicle, and would undoubtedly stop them for a few questions. Nothing major, just checking who they were and what they were up to. Trinidad wasn't a city-state, at least no more than any of the places out here were. But caution was always warranted, especially after what had happened to their own city. Now that they were next to the city, their phones had a signal again. They each turned their devices on, and they each began dinging and making endless chimes as messages rolled in. Anna called Landon and let him know where they were. It took a few minutes for them to get through the wall and the guards that were stationed there. It took some time, but they didn't have any issues going through it. Once they were through, Landon, through Anna, gave them directions on where to meet him. He was working with an expedition company that was doing regular dives into the nearby dimensional zone. Nate had been avoiding this particular zone simply because of how close it was. He didn't want to do too many in one place, especially in the beginning. People might begin to have suspicions about the location of the creator of all the buildings if he did that. It helped that the monsters of this particular dimensional zone were also fairly strong. Any traps he might create wouldn't be strong enough to hurt most of them yet. Research would help with that, and he was gradually working his way up to being able to take on stronger enemies by doing that at the other dungeons. It was simply a matter of time. They found Landon sitting on the steps of a large building, waiting for them. He jumped to his feet when they drove up and ran toward them. "Would you look at this? My little sister is already old enough to leave home and go on her first road trip with friends. She's graduated high school and has now become a proper hunter. Our little Linlin is all grown up." Landon cried out while wiping away a fake tear. Anna kissed his cheek and rolled her eyes. "Yeah, laugh it," Lindsay muttered as she opened the driver's door. "Oh, that's not nice, little Linlin," Nate teased. "Your older brother is just looking out for you." Landon chuckled and gave him a fist bump. "Let me grab my car and then I'll show you to my place." The plan was to stay in the Trinidad area for a couple of days. The company Landon was a part of had volunteered to include them on an expedition trip. Landon and Anna would be the ones mainly in charge of keeping an eye on them. They wouldn't necessarily be allowed to do anything, but they were still allowed to come. It would be up to them to learn whatever they could from the experience, or simply to enjoy being taken along for the ride. Angela looked around curiously as they drove through the inner city to Landon's apartment. With the work her family did, she had been to plenty of other walled cities. However, they all tended to head more inland than the direction they were currently going. The last time she had been to this portion of the state was many years before. Landon's apartment was a clean first-floor affair. As a professional hunter, he needed a lot of room and access to certain washing and cleaning facilities. Most of his equipment was cleaned by the company at their building. There were always items that they inevitably missed, though. The apartment itself held racks of polished but chipped and partially broken kopeshes and other armor. Each one was a blade he had wielded at some point in the past, or a set of armor that had saved his life. The beasts they were fighting were not exactly soft targets, and it wasn't uncommon for someone who used blades to go through dozens of them during their career. Just as archers had to continually upgrade their bows, all the other weapons a user could think of had to be upgraded at some point as well. Lindsay roamed through each of the rooms, taking quick pictures of the place before her brother could stop her. She was cackling madly as she dashed from place to place, her cell phone in hand. "Oh, Mom is going to love this shot," she yelled from the bathroom. "When was the last time you cleaned the sink? And why are your boxers hanging from the shower rack?" Landon blushed and ran after her. "He really should have expected her to do something like that," Anna said, wandering over to the fridge and pulling out a jug of cold water. Their mother is always trying to get him and all the other siblings to send photos of their homes. Lindsay is simply the only one young enough to still get bribed into doing something about it. Nate leaned against the counter with Angie as they enjoyed the show. Over the last few months, he had come to know the Travers better and appreciate their special brand of weird.